This video will be a review of the single-player campaign of Titanfall 2. Respawn Entertainment deserved much more than it got after releasing Titanfall 2. Despite having one of the strongest FPS campaigns in years, a solid and fun multiplayer, and an excellent business model with cosmetic only, you get what you pay for microtransactions that funded free, multiple updates. It was quickly forgotten and buried after releasing right in between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. There's still a small, consistent multiplayer community, and the release of Apex Legends did boost its player counts a bit, but I don't really think the single-player campaign is appreciated enough for how good it was. If you're a fan of FPS campaigns and Titanfall 2 slipped under the radar, please allow me to try and convince you of why it is worth playing. So, let's talk about the excellent single-player campaign of Titanfall 2. I'll admit, most of this review is going to be extremely positive because, well, I absolutely love Titanfall 2's campaign. It was an incredibly enjoyable experience for me, and one that I would love to go back and experience again at some point. Because of the extreme amounts of positivity I plan on giving this game, I want to start the review off with the only part of the game that I would really consider below average, and that would be the actual story of this campaign. The overarching story falls completely flat, and it's pretty unremarkable outside of a few engaging moments. Besides Jack, Cooper, and BT, there are zero characters that are even remotely interesting or have any sort of personality. Even Cooper, the protagonist, is only a little bit interesting because of his relationship with BT and the things that the two of them go through together. The actual sequence of events and plot of the story slowly gets more ridiculous and nonsensical over time. It starts off simple with Cooper just trying to survive while being hunted by the IMC, but ends up with the militia trying to stop a magical doomsday device from destroying their home planet. And the main antagonists of the game are a bunch of bounty hunters that are just kind of comical. They have no real personality other than that they're very bad and evil, but I will admit their introductions are pretty fun most of the time.
You were not invited to Kane's party, and that's why you're dead. Well, another runaway hero with an SRS Vanguard class Titan. Woo! Now we're talking!
The truth is that the plot just isn't interesting at all, but here's the weird part. I can't even find it in me to criticize the game for that. I'll admit, I may have lied a little bit when I said this part was going to be negative because it's really not, and there's two reasons for that. Reason 1. I believe that the story is as ridiculous as it is because that was the only way Respawn could stuff in all of the crazy gameplay mechanics and still have it somewhat make sense. But we'll focus much more on that later. Right now, I want to talk about reason 2, which is that the game works incredibly well as a simple, focused tale of Cooper and BT, a pilot and his Titan, working together to survive against all odds. Despite how nonsensical the actual events of the story are, there are so many small details and moments put into the game with regards to BT and Cooper's relationship that shows that they absolutely did not just phone it in for this one, and there was a lot of thought put into it. But to really analyze this idea, I'm going to have to spoil some things about the game, and since the gameplay section is going to be almost entirely spoilers, you can consider this your spoiler warning for the story and all gameplay mechanics. You should only keep watching if you've already played Titanfall 2, don't care about spoilers, or you just need a little bit more convincing, and you don't mind getting a little bit spoiled for you. You can skip to the timestamp on the screen now to hear a short spoiler-free summary of how I feel on the game if you don't want it spoiled for you. Now that the spoiler warning is out of the way, let's continue where we left off with talking about Cooper and BT's relationship. Cooper and BT aren't very unique. In fact, Cooper is basically every generic video game soldier dude and could have easily been someone straight out of Call of Duty. BT is slightly more interesting, but it's still an idea that's been done plenty of times before. He's a robot that doesn't understand human slang fully and often takes things completely literally, which is what allows the humorous moments of the story to occur. It's only the combination of these two and a lot of clever moments that really makes them interesting. The game actually starts with Cooper as a normal soldier, and he lacks most of the powers and abilities that pilots have. He eventually becomes a pilot after his mentor transfers ownership of BT over to him right before dying. This is a clever way of demonstrating the overwhelming power difference between a pilot and a normal soldier, and it's the first way that the game really makes you care about BT. Regardless of the story itself, the extreme power increase that comes with becoming a pilot made me feel a little bit attached to BT purely through gameplay. The dialogue that occurs during missions helps you understand BT a little bit better, and a bond slowly develops between the two of them, along with some genuinely funny lines from BT that made me appreciate him more. The first couple missions of the game shows the build-up of the bond between the two characters, with dialogue between Cooper and BT as well as some excellent individual moments. One of my personal favorite scenes is a great example of all the care and passion that went into making the campaign, and I think you have to watch it to really understand.
Got you.
I love this part because it happens completely in-game without needing a cutscene, and the moment after BT catches Cooper and gives an awkward thumbs up is great. The little mannerism BT shows when he pauses for a second like he's processing before giving the thumbs up makes the scene so much better, and it shows that a lot of thought was put into this game. If the first few missions show the build-up, then the final two missions show the payoff of BT and Cooper's bonds. In these missions, BT constantly sacrifices himself for Cooper, and even though the way it's presented is rather cliche and almost comical in a lot of cases, the build-up of their relationship made these moments actually impactful, and I felt something when BT was destroyed or when he sacrificed himself for Cooper and the militia. Just goes to show how important execution is, even when the game's actual plot is pretty weak. The game's plot was dumb, but it had elements that I really enjoyed, so I was still engaged with the story all the way through, and I think that is an accomplishment. I've covered the story quite a bit, so let's get into something related to gameplay, because I think that's where the campaign really shines. The way I see it, gameplay in Titanfall 2 can be broken down into three main parts: pilot mechanics, Titan mechanics, and level design or unique level mechanics. I consider pilot and Titan mechanics to be anything that you always have access to when you're in pilot or Titan mode, which includes movement, gunplay, special abilities, and Titan loadouts. Level design and unique mechanics are things that only exist within levels themselves. Unique environmental or temporary mechanics, as well as large set pieces that occur in parts leading up to the end of the game. I want to go through each of these separately and nail down what each one does well and maybe what could have been improved, starting with pilot mechanics. It really does feel great to move around in Titanfall. Running, sliding, wall jumping, it's all smooth, and for the most part, even if you're unskilled, there's a flow that you can often get into that makes you feel unstoppable. It's clear that Respawn is very confident in their movement system because they throw so many challenges at you that ask you to platform or wall run across a level, even when there's no shooting or Titan fighting involved at the same time. After a while, these sections with no enemies can get a little bit boring because it's the same thing every time, besides a few occasions where level mechanics makes platforming more interesting. As for gunplay and gun variety, it's really up to the player how interesting it's going to be for them. There aren't a ton of extremely unique weapons, but there's enough different ones that if you go into it planning to swap weapons around a lot, it's unlikely you get tired of shooting by the end of the campaign. I tried this in my own playthrough and it made my experience much more enjoyable. I constantly picked up new guns to try them out, and found some of them that I really liked even if they weren't necessarily the best. I particularly enjoyed using the Mastiff shotgun, which fires projectiles in a wide arc, and it's great for shooting while wall running. I do find myself wishing there were a bit more interesting variations in the game. The lack of variety doesn't make it unenjoyable, but I would say it's no more than adequate. While in pilot mode, you also have two different ability slots. One is like a grenade slot that can be filled with a few different types, and the other is an invisibility mechanic that lets you hide from enemies for a few seconds. All the different types of grenades were fun to use, although some of them aren't particularly useful, but I think in a single player campaign, balance isn't really that important as long as it's fun. The invisibility mechanic on its own is fine, but I think it really represents a missed opportunity, which would be having more abilities. In the multiplayer, invisibility is just one of the many different options that pilots have for their ability slot, instead of being the only thing you can use. I do find myself wishing that the campaign had found a way to incorporate more of the really interesting mechanics from the multiplayer. There would definitely be a lot of challenges involved with introducing them, but I think it could have been done and it would have added so much to the experience. Perhaps they could be similar to Titan loadouts, where you pick them up during the campaign and then you can switch to them whenever you want. I know this wouldn't work with all of them, but I don't think something like Phase Shift or Hollow Pilot would have broken the game at any point. I know the grappling hook would ruin the platform elements of the game, but if added correctly, it might make some parts more enjoyable. The grappling hook could be a temporary power that is only given at certain times, similar to the time travel mechanic. This would have allowed platforming challenges to be built around the grappling hook specifically, and could have made for a fun level without affecting the rest of the game. But to be fair, despite being slightly disappointed with this lack of variety, the game certainly makes up for it in other areas. And that just about does it for everything I have to say about the pilot mechanics, so next we should cover how Titans work in Titanfall 2. Titans are kind of what the game is famous for. I mean, it's in the name of the game itself. And they're one of the things that really separates this campaign from other FPS titles like Call of Duty. You have your own Titan, BT, but there's also quite a lot of enemy Titans that you have to fight against. In the multiplayer, going against more than one Titan at once is almost sure to end badly, but in the campaign you're asked to fight multiple enemy Titans over and over again. The boss fights against the mercenaries are always Titan on Titan battles, and the mercenaries usually have a few extra Titans on their side to make things harder for the player. Since an AI will never be as good as a human, I imagine this was the way Respawn found that they could actually make Titan battles somewhat difficult. Of course, difficulty as a whole depends on what difficulty setting the game is set to, but that mostly just changes health and damage as far as I can tell. When you're in BT, you have quite a few different abilities to use, and that number is increased by the numerous Titan loadouts you find during the levels. With each Titan loadout, there's a different primary weapon you have, as well as an offensive, defensive, and utility ability. Finally, each loadout has a different core, which is an extremely powerful ability, sort of like an ultimate in Overwatch. I approach Titans in a similar way to how I approach guns, by using as many different types as I could. It's clear that a lot of work went into making each Titan feel unique, because they really are all extremely different. Some of them are tanky, while others are light and fast. Some have close range weapons, while others have long range ones. From a variety standpoint, there's really nothing to complain about. And when it comes to the actual Titan versus Titan combat, it's mostly excellent. Even though the AI of the ground troops is not very good at all, I found the AI of the enemy Titans to be pretty solid. It's definitely predictable, but the enemy Titans will respond to your attacks and often use all of their abilities to try and stop you. One thing I noticed and really liked was how enemy Titans will often use their core abilities in longer drawn out fights, like one that happens near the end of the campaign. If I wasn't careful, I would sometimes get obliterated by the same ability I'd used earlier to wipe out the enemy. Even though it was predictable, I will say that since the enemies have the exact same abilities that you have, it felt like a real battle where I had to use strategy to win. Granted, the difficulty I was playing on definitely might have impacted it, and for reference I played it on hard. My one criticism of Titan combat has to do with the boss battles. Most of them are just too easy. A few of them have some interesting ideas, and I think the best one is easily the one against Viper, whereas Titan actually flies around and you have to shoot him down. But with most boss fights, as long as you have your core available, you can pretty much kill every boss instantly. Most of the boss fights are basically the exact same as normal Titan encounters, except for Viper and maybe the final boss with Sloane, where she sometimes leaves and makes you fight other Titans and Reapers. but that one is pretty underwhelming to be honest. If I had to guess, I would say that this problem comes from the fact that Respawn didn't want to put in Titans with special abilities or ones that have way more health than what you have. Maybe because they wanted to use the stuff they had already created for the multiplayer mode, or because of some design choice, I don't really know for sure. Outside of some disappointing boss battles, Titan combat is quite excellent overall. And that's pretty much all I've got to say about things Titan related. So now I'll move on to the final section, level design, as well as the unique mechanics found in certain levels. I think one thing that can absolutely be said about Titanfall 2 is that every level is extremely unique visually. You go from jungles to factories to giant satellite dishes and many more unique locations. I certainly never got tired of looking at the game because there was always a lot of new stuff as levels progressed. Of course, what you actually do in those missions is far more important, and the campaign doesn't disappoint in that regard. Most of the levels in the game are very well designed and a joy to play through. Since Titanfall 2 is almost like two games in one with pilot gameplay and Titan gameplay, it's very important that there be a clear distinction between these two parts, and a reason for you to hop out of your Titan every once in a while. Oftentimes, this takes the form of an obstacle that BT cannot pass, or when one of your enemies separates you from BT. And I think it's in those moments where BT is out of the picture that the levels become really engaging and where there's a lot of creativity. Earlier, I said that Respawn had to make the story ridiculous so they could justify all the interesting and different gameplay mechanics in the campaign. So let me explain what I meant by that. In Titanfall 2's relatively short 4 to 5 hour campaign, it really doesn't slow down at all. Almost every new level introduces something new, whether it's an interesting interactive environment, a new ability, unique weapons, or simply a brilliant spectacle. You go from moving through a massive assembly line factory to traveling through time inside an abandoned research facility to crossing a network of massive satellite dishes one after another, and that pace lasts for the entire game. It's hard to blame the writers for the slightly ridiculous story when they had to connect all these crazy ideas, and just as fast as these things are introduced, they're cast away and replaced with something new. Once you're done with a level, most likely you're done with that level's unique mechanic for the rest of the campaign. On the one hand, this fast pace made me feel like my time was never being wasted. There's no point in the game where a mechanic is hammered over the player's head over and over again until they're sick of it, but at the same time, I don't really feel like a lot of interesting ideas ever reach their full potential, and in some cases I think they were dropped too soon. The only mechanic that felt really fleshed out was the time travel used in Effect and Cause, which is my personal favorite level and generally seems to be very popular among everyone else that has played the game. What was most impressive about that level was that it took this one idea of traveling to two different time periods and asked the player to do a bunch of different things with it. It started out simple, with the player not being able to control the time shifts, but once the player is allowed to choose when to time travel, there are plenty of unique ideas in play. The two pillars of pilot gameplay, combat and platforming, are both elevated by the introduction of the single button press, which is what makes it so well designed. Of course, some levels are weaker than others, and few even attempt to do what was done in Effect and Cause. Instead, most of the levels focus on either a cool gameplay element or an extremely interesting spectacle, and the weakest ones are the ones that don't really have either of those things and end up being extremely basic. There's one mission where you're traveling through a factory and there's nothing interesting to do or see. You just shoot people for 20 minutes until the mission is over. Thankfully, most of the missions are very well put together and remain engaging throughout. One of the most impressive elements in the campaign was how fun and interesting some of the moments that were pure spectacle ended up being. I grew up playing Call of Duty, and even though I no longer have any interest in the series, for me some moments from games like Modern Warfare 2 were so visually incredible that I still very clearly remember them to this day. Scenes like climbing up the snowy mountain and killing Shepard with the knife in slow motion were so impressive to me when I saw them for the first time, even though they were kind of ridiculous. It's difficult to say whether Titanfall 2's highlights measure up to those moments, and only time will tell, but I can say that some of the parts of this game really succeed at being interesting and memorable. Moments like when BT throws you for the first time, and a lot of the segments in the final mission where you're part of a massive space chase trying to catch up to the enemy. You get thrown forward onto ships ahead of you, have to wall ride across ships to reach new places, and you even have an awesome boss battle on top of the enemy ship against a flying Titan. I can't deny that I was extremely impressed with a lot of these segments, and I think anyone who enjoys rather silly action like I do will have a lot of fun with moments in the campaign. Well, that's all I've got to say about unique mechanics, and that's the last part of this review. To wrap things up, I'll try and answer the question of whether or not you should buy Titanfall 2 for its campaign. I believe the answer is without a doubt, yes. Cooper and BT have so many great moments in dialogue that even though each character on their own is pretty weak, you really start to care about what happens to both of them, and that feeling lasts for the entire campaign. As for gameplay, it's a lot of fun, from the gunplay to the Titan combat to all the unique mechanics introduced in each new level. Considering how often the game goes on sale, you can probably buy it for like $5, and the campaign alone is worth at least that amount. And if you enjoy the multiplayer, it could be worth much more than that, assuming you can still find people to play with, that is. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this review. It's the first video I've ever made, and I plan to keep making more in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.